The fire truck stopped dead in front of the bridge, lights flashing, engine roaring, and nowhere to go. The red barrier arm cut across the road like a hard line in the sand. Engines idled behind it. Horn started low, then built into a wall of noise. I stood 20 yards back, boots on gravel, listening to steel hum under pressure. Something about that sound felt different today. The driver leaned out, confused, staring at a crossing that had never been closed before. And that was the problem. This bridge was never supposed to be theirs. Not even close. 3 months ago, this road was quiet. 2 lanes of cracked asphalt leading into Willow Creek Estates. A neat little HOA community tucked behind my land like it had always belonged there. It didn't. I bought 2,400 acres just outside their boundary line. Rolling fields, old timber, and one narrow bridge that cut across a shallow river. The only clean access point for miles. I remember the first morning I walked it. The metal railing was cold. Paint chipped. Bolts older than I was. My father built that bridge in '84. Handled the permits himself. Paid for every inch. He used to say one thing. Control the crossing, control everything. Back then, it sounded like pride. Maybe stubbornness. I didn't realize it was a warning. The first time I saw her, she was already acting like she owned the place. White Lexus. Perfect lines. Idling right at the edge of my property. Victoria Hale. HOA president. Clipboard in hand like it gave her authority over gravity itself. She smiled when I walked up. Too polished. Too certain. We've been meaning to talk about access, she said. Access. Not permission. Not agreement. Just access. That word stuck with me longer than it should have. I told her the bridge was private. Always had been. She nodded like she understood. But her eyes said something else. 2 weeks later, construction trucks rolled through at 6 a.m. diesel in the air. Tires grinding over steel. No notice. No call. Just movement. I stepped out onto the bridge, felt it vibrate under weight it wasn't designed for. The foreman waved a stack of permits. County stamped. Clean. Too clean. Something didn't line up. By noon, they'd installed a temporary sign at the entrance. Community access route. Bright white letters. Like it had always been there. I pulled it out of the ground myself. Tossed it into the ditch. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. The next morning, it was back. Bolted this time. And that's when I noticed the traffic didn't stop anymore. Cars flowed through like it was public. Like I didn't exist. Like ownership was just a suggestion. I checked the county map that night. Zoomed in. Zoomed out. The line didn't move. The bridge sat fully on my parcel. No shared easement. No public designation. Just mine. Clean. Absolute. Which made what they were doing a lot worse. Because they weren't confused. They were betting I wouldn't push back. They were counting on time. On volume. On pressure. And the part that really didn't sit right, they were already building more homes behind it. A lot more. Every truck that crossed made that bridge more important. More necessary. More valuable. I stood there the next morning, watching another convoy roll through, metal groaning under the load, and realized something I should have seen earlier. They weren't just using my bridge. They were building their entire neighborhood around it. I woke up before sunrise the next day and drove the full length of the property line with the windows down, cold air cutting through the cab and carrying the faint smell of diesel from somewhere ahead. It should not have been there that early. Not on my side. The gravel shifted under my tires as I slowed near the ridge, and that was when I saw them again. Another set of trucks. Different company logos this time. Same direction. Same bridge. They did not even hesitate when they reached it. No pause. No check. Just straight across like they had been doing it for years. That was new. I pulled over and stepped out, boots crunching against the frost, and listened. The bridge answered back with a low metallic hum, deeper than before, like it was carrying more than it should. I walked closer and placed my hand on the railing. The vibration ran straight up my arm. It was subtle, but it was there. Something had changed overnight. I stood there for a moment. Longer than I should have, watching the last truck disappear into Willow Creek, and realized they were not slowing down. They were scaling up. Back at the house, I spread the old documents across the kitchen table. Yellowed edges. Faint ink. My father's handwriting in the margins, tight and precise. He never trusted shortcuts. Every permit. Every inspection. Every measurement was recorded. I ran my fingers along the original construction drawings. Load limits. Reinforcement notes. Drainage calculations. It was all there. And one line stood out more than anything else. Private agricultural crossing. No public access granted. I read it twice. Then a third time. The language was clean. No gray area. No loophole. Which made what I was seeing outside harder to ignore. I stepped outside again and looked toward the tree line where the road dipped toward the bridge. From this distance, you could barely see it. Just a thin break in the green. Easy to overlook if you did not know what it was. Maybe that was how this started. Maybe someone assumed it was public. Or maybe they just decided it was easier that way. My phone buzzed in my pocket. Unknown number. I let it ring once, then answered. A man's voice. Calm. Polite. Too polished. He introduced himself as a project manager working with the HOA expansion. Expansion. That word landed heavier than it should have. He explained they were adding new residential phases behind the existing development. More homes. More infrastructure. More traffic. He spoke like everything was already approved. Already settled. I asked him a simple question. Who authorized access across my bridge? There was a pause on the line. Not long. Just enough to notice. Then he said something that did not sit right. He said access had been established through community usage. Not permission. Not agreement. Usage. I ended the call without another word and looked back toward the road. Another car crossed in the distance. Then another. The pattern was clear now. They were not asking anymore. They were normalizing it. I walked back inside, closed the door, and stared at the documents spread across the table. My father built that bridge to serve this land. Not theirs. Not anyone else's. And yet somehow, they were turning it into the backbone of everything they were building. I stepped back outside one more time and watched the steady stream of vehicles roll across steel that did not belong to them, and that was when I understood exactly what they were counting on. By the third morning, the sound changed again. It was not just a hum anymore. It was a steady, layered vibration, like the bridge was carrying a rhythm it was never designed to hold. I stood at the edge of the crossing and counted. One truck every 40 seconds. Sometimes faster. No gaps. No hesitation. That was not random traffic. That was planning. I stepped aside as a black SUV rolled past me without even slowing down. Tinted windows. Clean paint. HOA sticker on the windshield. They did not look at me. That was new too. The first week, people slowed. They glanced over. Some even waved like they were unsure. Now they drove like I was invisible. Like this had always been theirs. I watched the rear tires hit the center span and listened for the shift in tone. There it was. A deeper note. Subtle, but consistent. I had heard that sound before. Years ago, standing next to my father while he checked stress points during a storm season. He used to tap the rail and listen. Said steel tells the truth if you know how to hear it. Right now, it was saying something I did not like. I walked back toward my truck and noticed fresh gravel packed along the roadside near the entrance. That had not been there yesterday. It was leveled. Smoothed. Prepared. Someone was improving access. Not maintaining it. Changing it. I crouched down and picked up a handful. Fine grade. Delivered recently. Still dry. That meant overnight work. Quiet work. The kind you do when you do not want questions. I stood up and looked toward the tree line again. There was a new sign posted just beyond the bend. Larger than before. Permanent this time. Willow Creek Expansion Phase 2 Access. Clean lettering. Metal posts set deep. That was not temporary thinking. That was commitment. I felt the shift right then. Not anger. Not yet. Something sharper. Like a puzzle piece sliding into place. I drove into town an hour later and stopped by the county records office. The air inside was stale. Paper and dust. The clerk barely looked up as I walked in. I asked for any recent filings tied to Willow Creek Estates. She pulled a stack without hesitation. Too fast. Like she had already done this before. That detail stuck with me. I sat down at a small desk and started flipping through the documents. Development permits. Utility plans. Road extensions. Everything stamped and approved. Clean. Organized. Almost too clean. Then I saw it. A routing map. Highlighted in yellow. The main access road feeding the entire expansion. It ran straight through my bridge. No alternative route marked. No contingency. Nothing. I leaned back in the chair and stared at it for a long second. They had not just used my bridge. They had designed everything around it. Every new home. Every street. Every utility line depended on that crossing holding steady. I flipped to the next page and saw projected traffic volume. It doubled what the bridge was originally rated for. Not immediately. Over time. Gradual load increase. Just enough to avoid attention. Just enough to make it seem normal. That was the plan. Normalize it. Expand it. Lock it in. By the time anyone questioned it, it would be too big to undo. I closed the folder slowly and looked back down at the map one more time. The yellow line did not move. It never crossed a boundary line. It just assumed it could. I walked out of the building into the bright afternoon light and stood there for a moment, letting the heat settle in. Cars passed by. Normal day. Nothing out of place. Except now I could see it. The whole thing. They were not just taking access. They were building a system that could not function without me. And the part that mattered most was how quietly they were doing it. The next morning, I did something I had not done once since this started. I stepped onto the bridge and stopped right in the middle. No truck. No car. Just me and the sound of water moving slow under steel. The air smelled clean for a second. Then it shifted. Engine noise in the distance. Always the same direction. Always coming toward me. I turned and watched. The first pickup approach. It slowed this time. The driver rolled down his window halfway. He looked at me like I was the one out of place. "You holding things up?" he asked. Casual. Like this was his road now. That question told me everything. I stepped aside without answering. Let him pass. Let all of them pass. One by one. A steady stream. No gaps. No hesitation. That rhythm again. It was not just traffic anymore. It was dependence. I walked back to my truck and noticed something new near the entrance. A small security booth. Temporary build. Fresh wood. Plastic windows still covered in protective film. No one inside yet. But it was positioned perfectly. Facing outward. Watching the road leading to the bridge. Not watching the bridge itself. That detail mattered. They were not protecting the structure. They were controlling the flow. I leaned against the door and studied it for a moment longer than I should have. A setup like that does not appear overnight without intent. It meant they were preparing for something. Or someone. I got my answer about an hour later. A white SUV pulled in behind me. Same clean lines. Same quiet engine. Victoria stepped out like she had been there 100 times before. Sunglasses. Clipboard. That same calm smile. She did not look at the bridge. She looked at me. We should clear up some confusion, she said. Her voice was steady. Controlled. Like this was already settled in her mind. I stayed where I was. Let her talk. She explained that the community had established a necessary access route through consistent use. Said it like it was a legal fact. Not a strategy. She mentioned safety. Emergency services. Growth. All the right words. All carefully chosen. But one thing did not line up. She never said the word permission. Not once. I asked her directly who approved construction traffic across private land. She paused. Just for a second. Then she shifted. Said the county had recognized the road as functionally integrated into the development. Functionally integrated. That phrase hung there. It sounded official. It was not. I could hear it in the way she said it. Clean delivery. No specifics. No document. Just confidence. That was the play. Speak like it is already true. Let people assume the rest. A truck passed behind her while she was talking. Loud. Heavy. She did not even flinch. That told me she was used to it now. Used to the volume. Used to the load. Used to the bridge carrying more than it should. She stepped closer and tapped her clipboard lightly. We are moving forward with Phase 2 next week, she said. It is important we do not disrupt access. There it was. Not a request. Not even a warning. A statement. Forward momentum. No room for pause. I looked past her toward the road. More vehicles lining up in the distance. Waiting their turn. All of them pointed at one place. The crossing. My crossing. And in that moment, something became very clear. She was not here to negotiate. She was here to confirm that I would not interfere. I watched her get back into her SUV, the door closing with a soft, precise click, and as she pulled away without waiting for a response, I realized she had already made her assumption. I let her leave without saying a word, but that did not mean I stayed still. By noon, I was back at the house with every document spread across the table again. The sunlight cut across the pages, highlighting ink that had not faded in decades. My father did not leave loose ends. I checked every line twice. Then a third time. The language did not change. Private crossing. No shared access. No implied use. That part was clean. But something else started to surface the longer I looked. A clause tucked between drainage specs and maintenance notes. It outlined operational control. Not just ownership. Control. That word sat heavier than anything else. I leaned back and stared at it. If I controlled operation, then access was not automatic. It was conditional. That was a different game entirely. I stepped outside and drove back to the bridge before the afternoon traffic hit its peak. The air felt warmer now. Thicker. Like the land itself was adjusting to what was happening on it. I parked just off the entrance and watched the flow again. Cars moved faster today. Less hesitation. More confidence. That was not accidental. People had already accepted this as routine. That was the real shift. Not the construction. Not the paperwork. The mindset. I walked toward the new booth and this time someone was inside. A man in a reflective vest. Clipboard resting on his lap. He looked up as I approached, then glanced past me toward the road like he was checking something. Not me. The traffic. "Can I help you?" he asked. Polite. Neutral. Practiced. I asked who he was working for. He said he was contracted by the HOA to monitor access flow during expansion. Monitor. Not manage. Not enforce. Just monitor. Another word choice that did not sit right. I nodded and stepped closer to the edge of the bridge. He did not stop me. That told me everything about his authority. I stood there and watched 3 vehicles pass in under a minute. The steel beneath my boots carried the same low tone. Constant. Predictable. And that was when it hit me. They were not worried about me blocking access. They were worried about losing control of the flow if something disrupted it. That was why the booth faced outward. That was why they were tracking volume. Not structure. I turned back toward the man and asked him if he had ever seen the bridge closed. He shook his head immediately. "No reason to," he said. Simple answer. Too simple. No reason to. I thanked him and walked back to my truck, but I did not leave. I sat there with the engine off, watching the line of vehicles build and release in waves. Each one depended on timing. Space. Clearance. All of it centered on a single point. A narrow stretch of steel that had never been meant for this kind of load. I reached over and pulled the folder from the passenger seat again. Opened it to that clause. Operational control. I read it one more time, slower now. The language was clear. No ambiguity. Control meant decision. Decision meant timing. Timing meant everything. I closed the folder and looked back up at the bridge, watching another truck roll across without slowing, and that was when I realized something I should have seen from the start. I did not confront them the next day. I did not call a lawyer. I did not send a letter. Instead, I watched. From the ridge. From the truck. From the edge of the trees where the road dipped. Toward the bridge. The pattern kept building. Morning rush. Midday deliveries. Evening returns. Each wave a little heavier than the last. That was not just growth. That was reliance. By the 4th day, the line of cars stretched farther than I had seen before. It curved past the first turn inside Willow Creek, stacking quietly, waiting for the crossing to clear. No one questioned it. No one turned around. They just waited. That detail mattered. People will tolerate delay. They will not tolerate loss of access. Not for long. I drove out past the north boundary that afternoon and checked the terrain myself. Dense brush. Uneven ground. A shallow creek cutting through rock. No secondary road. No alternate path wide enough for consistent traffic. I followed the line for nearly half a mile just to be sure. Nothing. No backup route. No emergency bypass. Everything pointed back to one place. The bridge. I stood there for a moment, looking across the land, and felt the weight of that reality settle in. They had built everything behind a single point of entry. No redundancy. No margin. Just assumption. Back at the crossing, the booth was active now. 2 people this time. One logging numbers. The other watching flow. Not a single glance toward the structure itself. That part still bothered me. They were counting vehicles, not stress. Measuring movement, not load. I stepped onto the bridge again and let a gap form behind me. It did not take long. Within seconds, engines idled. A line built up. Drivers leaned forward in their seats, watching, waiting. No one honked. Not yet. Just quiet tension. That silence said more than noise ever could. I moved off again and the line released instantly. Like pressure snapping loose. That response was fast. Too fast. It told me they were already used to minor interruptions. Which meant the system could handle small delays. But not much more. I walked back to the truck and sat there with the engine off, hands resting on the steering wheel, listening to the rhythm reset. Flow. Pause. Flow again. Everything timed around that narrow stretch of steel. I pulled out the folder and opened it to the operational clause again. Control. Not ownership. Not presence. Control. I said the word out loud this time. It sounded different hearing it in the open air. Less abstract. More real. Control meant I did not need to fight them head on. It meant I did not need to stop anything immediately. It meant timing could do the work for me. I looked up as another convoy rolled through, heavier trucks this time, slower pace, deeper vibration under the bridge. The tone shifted again. Lower. Strained. It was still holding. But it was being asked to do more than it was ever meant to. And they were pushing it further every day. I closed the folder and set it aside, watching the steady stream continue without interruption, and that was when the next piece finally clicked into place. I stopped looking at the bridge as a structure and started seeing it as a switch. Not a road. Not a crossing. A switch. Something that could be on or off. Nothing in between. That thought stayed with me longer than it should have. I went back to the ridge that evening and watched the pattern settle into something predictable. The same trucks at the same times. The same gaps. The same release points. It was not random anymore. It was scheduled without being written down. That made it fragile. Systems like that break when one piece shifts. I pulled out my phone and started recording. Not the bridge. The flow. Time stamps. Intervals. Vehicle types. Light trucks. Heavy loads. Personal cars. Every detail mattered now. I tracked it for hours until the light dropped and the road turned into a line of red tail lights fading into the trees. That glow lingered longer than it should have. It looked steady. Reliable. Permanent. But it was not. The next morning, I returned before sunrise. No traffic yet. Just silence and the low sound of water under steel. I walked the full length of the bridge slowly, counting steps, feeling for any uneven shift under my boots. The structure held firm. Strong. My father built it that way. But it was never meant to carry a system this dependent on it. I stopped at the center and looked out across the land. No alternate roads. No side access. Just open ground and distance. Everything pointed back here. That was when I noticed something I had missed before. Near the base of the entrance, just off the main line, there was a small metal box mounted low against a post. New hardware. Clean edges. Recently installed. I crouched down and brushed the dust away. A control unit. Simple. Manual override for the barrier system they had not installed yet but were clearly planning for. That detail shifted everything. They were already thinking about control. They just assumed it would be theirs. I stood up slowly and looked back toward the booth. One worker inside, head down, writing something. He did not see me. That was fine. I was not there for him. I was there for the pattern. I stepped off the bridge and let the first vehicle of the morning approach. A delivery van. It slowed slightly, then rolled through without question. No check. No stop. No verification. That was the final confirmation. This entire system was built on assumption. Not enforcement. Not authority. Just assumption. I walked back to the truck and sat for a moment with the engine off, listening to the quiet brake as the day began. Then I reached into the glove box and pulled out a small envelope I had not opened in years. My father's notes. Personal ones. Not the official plans. The kind he kept separate. I unfolded the paper carefully. The ink was still sharp. One line stood out immediately. He had written it in all caps. If you ever lose control of the crossing, you never had it. I read it once. Then again. Slower. Control was not about owning the bridge. It was about deciding when it worked. And right now, I had not made that decision. I folded the paper back and looked out at the road as more vehicles started to line up in the distance, all of them moving toward the same narrow point, and that was when I realized exactly where the pressure needed to be applied. I did not touch the control box that day. I just studied it. The metal casing was new. No rust. No wear. Installed recently and wired clean. Whoever put it there knew exactly what they were doing. That detail mattered more than anything else. This was not random construction. This was planned control. I stood up and looked across the bridge again as the morning. Traffic built into its usual rhythm. Cars moved in steady waves. No stops. No checks. Just flow. That was their weakness. A system that depends on smooth flow cannot handle interruption. Not even a small one. I walked back to the truck and pulled out my notebook. Started writing times again. Not just volume now. Timing between clusters. Average gap. Peak pressure. I needed to understand how tight the system really was. By midday, the pattern was clear. Less than 40 seconds between vehicles during peak hours. Sometimes less. That left almost no buffer. No space to absorb delay. I watched a delivery truck hesitate halfway across the bridge when another vehicle slowed ahead. The entire line behind it compressed instantly. Engines idled. Heat rose off the pavement. No one moved for 12 seconds. Then it cleared. Just 12 seconds. But the reaction was immediate. That was the crack. Small. Almost invisible. But real. I leaned back against the truck and let that moment replay in my head. 12 seconds caused a backup. What would 30 do? What would a minute do? I did not need to test it yet. I already knew the answer. I drove back to the house and pulled out the rest of my father's records. Not just the bridge. The surrounding land. Utility easements. Drainage rights. Old survey maps. Every detail tied to how that crossing interacted with the rest of the property. It took hours to sort through. Dust rising. Paper shifting. But one thing kept repeating across every document. The bridge was not isolated. It was tied into everything. Water flow. Load limits. Maintenance access. All controlled from my side. That meant something important. Any operational change would not just affect the road. It would affect the system connected to it. I sat back and let that settle in. They thought they were expanding outward. Building something independent. But everything they built still depended on a point they did not control. That kind of dependency does not show itself right away. It waits. It builds quietly. Until one moment forces it into the open. I stepped outside again as the sun started dropping behind the trees. The road was still busy. Still steady. Still. Confident. That confidence felt misplaced now. I could see the pressure building behind it. Layer by layer. Vehicle by vehicle. Every crossing added weight. Not just physical. Structural. Operational. Psychological. They were getting used to this working. That was the real risk. I walked back toward the ridge and watched the line of headlights stretch deeper into the property as evening traffic stacked up. It looked stable. It looked permanent. But I knew better now. Systems like this do not fail because they are weak. They fail because they are too dependent on one thing. And standing there, watching another wave of cars roll across that narrow strip of steel without a second thought, I realized they had already crossed the point where a small change would no longer stay small. I did not keep this to myself. Not completely. The next morning, I drove into town again, but this time I did not go to the records office. I went to someone who understood land the way my father did. Old surveyor. Name was Dale Harper. 60 years old, maybe more. Hands rough from decades of measuring lines people forgot existed. His office smelled like paper and coffee. Maps stacked everywhere. He looked up when I walked in, took one glance at the rolled documents under my arm, and nodded like he already knew why I was there. That detail stayed with me. I spread the bridge plans and the county routing map across his desk. He did not speak right away. Just leaned in, tracing the lines with a finger, slow and steady. When he reached the highlighted route running through the bridge, he paused. Not long. Just enough. Then he leaned back and let out a low breath. They built all this off one crossing, he said. Simple. Direct. No surprise in his voice. That told me this was not the first time he had seen something like this. I asked him about access rights. About usage claims. About anything that could shift ownership without permission. He shook his head once. Firm. Usage does not erase a boundary, he said. It just makes people forget it is there. That line stuck harder than anything else. Forgetting a boundary does not remove it. It just delays the moment someone enforces it. I asked him about load limits next. He pulled out a separate sheet and ran quick calculations, numbers moving faster than I expected. Then he stopped and tapped the page. This bridge was not designed for what they are planning, he said. No hesitation. No softening. Just fact. I felt that settle in deeper than anything I had seen so far. It was not just about control anymore. It was about pressure building on something that had limits. I asked him how long it could hold. He did not answer right away. That silence mattered. He finally looked up and said, long enough for them to believe it always will. That was the answer I needed. Not a timeline. A mindset. I gathered the papers and thanked him, but before I left, he said one more thing. If you are thinking about stepping in, do not do it halfway. I paused at the door and looked back at him. He was already looking down at another map. Conversation over. That was fine. I had heard enough. Back outside, the afternoon heat hit hard. The kind that makes everything feel slower than it is. I drove back toward the property and stopped at the ridge again. Same view. Same road. Same steady line of vehicles feeding into the crossing. Nothing looked different. That was the problem. Everything felt normal. Stable. Like it could go on forever. But I knew better now. The numbers. The timing. The structure. The dependency. All of it pointed to one thing. This system was already stretched tighter than it appeared. I watched a group of cars slow as a larger truck approached the bridge from the other side. They adjusted without thinking. Small corrections. Tiny pauses. The system absorbing stress in real time. But every adjustment cost something. Space. Time. Margin. Things they did not have much of anymore. I leaned against the truck and let the scene play out in front of me, steady and predictable on the surface, and that was when I understood exactly what kind of move this was going to require. I did not move the next day either. I let the system keep running exactly the way they wanted it to. Trucks rolled through. Cars stacked and released. The rhythm held. That was important. Any sudden change now would only alert them. I needed them comfortable. I needed them certain nothing would interrupt what they had already built. So I stayed out of sight. Watched from the ridge. Timed the flow again. Morning peak started earlier now. 15 minutes earlier than last week. That meant more people were depending on that crossing to stay on schedule. That detail mattered. The tighter their routines became, the less room they had for disruption. By midday, I drove down and walked past the booth without stopping. The worker glanced up, then went back to his clipboard. No questions. No concern. That told me I had already faded into the background. Exactly where I needed to be. I stepped onto the bridge and let the line build behind me again, just for a few seconds. Not enough to cause a scene. Just enough to feel the pressure gather. Engines idling. Tires creeping forward. No one honked. They were used to small delays. That was fine. Small delays were not the plan. I stepped off and the flow snapped back instantly. Fast. Predictable. Controlled. I kept walking and stopped near the control box again. Still untouched. Still clean. Still waiting. That piece was going to matter soon. Back at the house, I cleared the table and set only one document in the center. The operational clause. I read it out loud this time, slow and steady, making sure every word landed the way it was written. Control of access. Timing of use. Maintenance authority. It was all there. Everything I needed, without a single extra step. I did not need permission. I did not need approval. I just needed the right moment. I pulled out a blank notepad and started mapping the flow as a system. Entry point. Crossing. Exit. Delay points. Pressure buildup. Release timing. Every movement depended on the bridge staying open. That was the core of it. Not ownership. Not argument. Function. If the function changed, everything behind it shifted instantly. I marked the peak window. Early morning. Just before 8. Maximum density. Minimum tolerance for delay. That was when pressure would spike fastest. But I did not act yet. Not even close. I needed more. I needed them deeper into this. More homes. More traffic. More reliance. The kind you cannot step away from without consequences. I drove back to the ridge at sunset and watched the line stretch farther than I had seen all week. Headlights stacking into the trees. Brake lights pulsing like a slow heartbeat. It looked steady. Reliable. Like it had always been there. But I knew exactly how thin that stability really was. I stayed there until the last car crossed and the road finally went quiet again, and that was when I made the one decision that would change everything. The decision was simple once I said it out loud. I was not going to stop them early. I was going to let them go further. I woke up before sunrise the next morning and drove past the bridge without slowing. That alone felt different. For the first time, I did not stop to watch. I let the system run without me standing over it. That was the shift. Control did not mean constant presence. It meant choosing when not to act. By 8 o'clock, the traffic had already built into a solid line. Longer than yesterday. Tighter spacing. More urgency in the way people drove. They were cutting the gaps shorter now. Taking risks they did not even notice. That was new. I parked at the ridge and watched from a distance. The flow held. Barely. A delivery truck hesitated at the entrance, just a second too long. The entire line behind it compressed instantly. No horn. No complaint. Just pressure building in silence. That silence said everything. They were already stretched. They just did not know it yet. I pulled out the notebook and marked the time. 8:12. Peak compression. That window was tightening. That was exactly what I needed. I drove into town later that morning and passed the entrance to Willow Creek. New signage was already up. Phase 2 marketing boards. Clean designs. Promises of expansion. More homes. More access. That word again. Access. They were selling something they did not own. And people were buying it without question. I kept driving and circled back through a side road just to watch the traffic from another angle. Every vehicle still funneled to the same point. No deviation. No alternative. That confirmed it again. Total dependency. Back at the property, the booth had 2 workers again. One now holding a radio. Talking quietly. Watching the line more closely than before. That detail stood out. They were starting to feel it too. Maybe not fully. But enough to monitor. Enough to react if something shifted. I walked past them without stopping and stepped onto the bridge again, but this time I did not pause in the center. I kept moving. Let the flow continue uninterrupted. No signal. No interference. Nothing to raise concern. That was important. They needed to believe this was stable. Permanent. Untouchable. I reached the far side and turned back, watching the vehicles roll across without a second thought. That confidence was exactly what would break them later. I could see it clearly now. The pattern. The pressure. The assumption holding it all together. I did not need to force anything. I just needed to let it build one more step. One more phase. One more layer of reliance they could not walk away from. I stepped off the bridge and felt the vibration fade under my boots as the last truck in that wave cleared the span, and that was when I knew they were almost where I needed them to be. The morning I chose did not feel different at first. The air was still. Cool. The kind of quiet that settles just before everything starts moving. I parked farther back than usual and walked in on foot. Gravel under my boots. Slow steps. No rush. That mattered. I needed everything to look normal. The first wave of cars had already started forming by the time I reached the entrance. Engines idling. Headlights cutting through the early light. No one noticed me. That was exactly how I wanted it. I moved past the booth without a word. One worker glanced up, then looked back down at his radio. No signal. No warning. Just routine. I stepped onto the bridge and kept walking. No pause. No hesitation. Just crossing like every other day. The steel carried its usual low tone. Steady. Predictable. Beneath that, something tighter. Pressure sitting just under the surface. I reached the control box and stopped for the first time. My hand rested on the metal casing. Cool. Solid. Waiting. I looked up once, scanning the line building behind me. Cars were stacking. Faster than usual. The spacing tighter. The patience thinner. That told me everything I needed. They were at their limit. They just did not know it yet. I opened the panel slowly. No resistance. Clean install. Inside, the wiring was simple. Direct. Exactly the kind of system designed for quick control. Not permanent infrastructure. Temporary authority. That detail almost made me pause. Almost. I did not rush. That was the key. Every movement had to feel deliberate. Controlled. I adjusted the setting. Not a shutdown. Not yet. Just enough to change timing. A small shift. Seconds, not minutes. I closed the panel and stepped back without drawing attention. The first car reached the midpoint of the bridge as another approached from the opposite side. Both slowed. Not much. Just enough. That small delay rippled backward instantly. Engines idled longer. Tires crept forward. The line compressed. I kept walking. Did not look back. That was important. I needed to feel the system react without interfering again. By the time I reached the far side, the sound had changed. The smooth rhythm was gone. In its place, a staggered pattern. Stop. Roll. Stop again. Small disruptions. But they were stacking. I turned slightly, just enough to see without making it obvious. The bridge was full now. Vehicles nose to tail. No gaps. No release. The system was trying to correct itself. But it could not find the timing it relied on. Not anymore. A horn sounded. Then another. Short bursts. Uncertain. That was new. I kept moving, stepping off the bridge and onto the dirt path without breaking pace. Behind me, the pressure kept building. Slow. Quiet. Controlled chaos. Exactly where it needed to be. And I had not even touched the real switch yet. The horns did not last long. That was the first thing I noticed. They started sharp, impatient, then faded into something quieter. Uncertainty. Drivers leaned forward, trying to understand what was happening ahead. The line did not move the way it should have. Stop. Roll. Stop again. The rhythm was broken now. I stood just beyond the tree line, close enough to hear the engines, far enough to stay unseen. The bridge was holding every vehicle in place. Not completely stopped. Not yet. But close enough that the system could not recover on its own. That was the point. A system like this depends on timing more than speed. Once timing slips, everything behind it begins to stack. I watched the first driver step out of his car near the entrance. He looked ahead, then back, trying to make sense of the delay. Another door opened farther up the line. People were starting to notice. That shift came fast. Faster than I expected. The booth worker stepped outside, radio pressed to his ear, scanning the line with a look that was no longer calm. That told me the signal had reached them. They were aware now. But awareness does not fix dependency. I moved back toward the control box, slow and steady, like I had all morning. No rush. No panic. Just timing. I opened the panel again and paused for a second, listening. Engines idling. Voices carrying faintly across the steel. A low tension in the air. This was the moment my father had written about. Control was not a constant state. It was a decision. I adjusted the setting fully this time. Not a delay. Not a shift. A stop. The barrier arm dropped with a clean, hard sound that cut through everything else. It was not loud. But it was final. The next vehicle rolled forward and stopped short, inches from the red line. Behind it, the entire system locked in place. No movement. No release. Just a solid wall of cars stretching back into Willow Creek. I closed the panel and stepped away without looking back. I did not need to. I could hear it. The change in sound. No more rhythm. No more flow. Just idle engines and rising voices trying to figure out what had just happened. Minutes passed. Then more. The line did not clear. It could not. There was nowhere else to go. I walked up the ridge again and turned for one last look. The bridge sat exactly where it always had. Steel. Silent. Unmoving. The difference was not the structure. It was the decision behind it. Everything they had built now sat on the wrong side of a crossing they never controlled. And for the first time since this started, they were the ones waiting for access that was no longer automatic.